I cried a lot, and then I immediately put together my resume and I started just sending it to every company that seemed to be hiring.
How did you first get interested in UX or design?
I decided that I wanted to be an architect when I was 8 years old. I went to college for architecture.
You're only there for maybe about a year and then you're laid off.
Yeah, I was on an H-1B visa. If I don't find a new job in a certain amount of time, I have to leave. I think in design, my portfolio is the big thing because I want to know what problems did you solve and how did you solve them. I was laid off twice and it's still just a little blip in my 20 plus year career. And who knows, maybe I'll get laid off again.
Imagine building a thriving career in UX design, only to have the rug pulled out from under you, twice. Today's guest, Beril Maples, has faced those challenges head on and turned them into a powerful opportunity for growth. From her early dreams of becoming an architect to leading UX teams at companies like Salesforce and Google, Beril's career has been anything but linear. In this episode, we talk about the lessons she's learned from navigating tech layoffs, the skills that helped her pivot industries, and her advice for staying resilient in a competitive job market. I'm your host, Chris Abad, and this is Pixelated Path. If you're looking for inspiration and practical tips to weather the ups and downs of your career, this episode's for you. Before we dive in, don't forget to subscribe to Pixelated Path so you never miss an episode filled with actionable insights and inspiring stories. Let's jump in. Beril, you've had a pretty rich career with roles at Salesforce and Google. How did you first get interested in UX or design?
It wasn't a plan for me. I decided that I wanted to be an architect when I was 8 years old. We were visiting a family friend's home and I was bored because the adults were talking about boring things. So I started exploring and the owner of the house was an architect and I found his office and I saw this big architectural drawing and I said, that's what I want to do for the rest of my life. So that was it for me. I was 8 years old. I decided I went to college for architecture. Then I moved to New York to study at Columbia University to get a master's degree. And then I met technology. This was back in 1998. Columbia University Architecture School had started really investing in using computers in architectural design. So they had computer labs with SGI machines, and there were classes that were centered around using computers. And I just got interested in them. I even got a job as an assistant in the studio helping other students how to set up their computers or, use 3D software. And two of the professors who were primarily leading the computer generated software classes had a startup in New York. And they asked me, a few other students, to join their company after we graduated. And that's how I got started in it. So no education, no training in it, just pure interest and fortune.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Was there anything, if you remember back, was there anything that you felt drew you to architecture as you got older and sort of started to understand the field a little bit more? Or was it just all driven from that moment when you were 8 and seeing the drawing and kind of being at that house?
Yeah. I think what continued to pull me into architecture was really it wasn't art. It was design that, that had constraints, right? Because there's material constraints. And, eventually I learned at architecture school, there's regulation as well. That I wasn't thinking about that in high school. But, you had to design in a certain location for certain people. And, that was just a great challenge in a way. And I really admired some of I started reading about Frank Lloyd Wright and then the Bauhaus movement. Those were the available books in my high school library. And it really pulled me when I saw that these people were designing spaces for people to live differently. I mean, Bauhaus is weird in a way that like they also were very opinionated, right? Like they wanted to kind of almost like dictate how people live through that design. But yeah, like that was, I think, what really pulled me into it. Because I'm never good with art. Like I'm never the kind of person who will just kind of like sit there and suddenly have like this moment of creativity and create something beautiful. I'm more of a problem solver. So architecture was kind of that artistic thing that was about, more about like a problem solving with some criteria added to it.
Even though you didn't pursue a career in architecture, do you feel like there were skills or certain things that you learned through that education that helped you in the field today?
Yeah, I think it did. I think I studied architecture in Turkey, and it's like slightly different from a lot of the colleges in the US in that you have to take a lot of engineering classes in addition to all the architectural design classes. You have to understand, the physics of it or the material science. Not like a civil engineer would do, but like you have to have a good understanding of it. So I think like that part of it, understanding the drive to understand the technology that's going to help me build my designs like was really instrumental. So like even at the beginning of my UX career, like I was really interested in front-end engineering. I, learned JavaScript, HTML, CSS, like all that stuff. And I was, at the company I was working for, I was really coding some of the stuff that I designed. Back in the day, you were kind of like more technically hybrid and, you had to do some hand coding. That was the expectation. So that was one thing. And then the other one was like, I think like it gave me a certain type of resilience that you don't always get your way as the creative person, right? Like there's always that relationship with the client or with the technology partners. Like, it's all about negotiation and finding the best solution with the constraints given. And I think, that really made me like not become like too attached to certain designs. Like I was really able to take criticism. I can like anyone can rip my design up and like I won't get offended. But that like you had to go through the sadness of architecture school and being yelled at by professors to be able to get to that stage.
There's a lot of lessons there that I think resonate so much with being in UX design. Like you could almost interchange what you said is, I learned this in architecture. This is what was necessary for architecture. You could
Yeah.
replace that with UX design and it'd be the same.
Mhm.
Do
Yeah.
you, do you think so? For people who are coming into the field today, a lot of them can go to school for UX design. UX design didn't necessarily exist as a field of study when we went to school.
Mhm.
Are there things that you feel like you learned in architecture that were super helpful for UX that maybe feels missing from the UX education today?
I think so. And I wouldn't say people shouldn't go get UX educations, but like build on it by studying some adjacent things as well. One of the things I'm noticing about the UX education and UX discipline today is we are almost like process obsessed, like the double diamonds and, like, oh my goodness, all the projects have to start with user research. And then all the projects have to go through like these stages, right? And given the context that you're in, not every step is always necessary, right? Like you're in-house working for a company that has the same customers and has had the same customers for the past 20 years. You don't need to do like research again and again to understand what their problems are, right? Like at some point, you're not finding any new information. So I feel like there's this like over focus on process and like how you do the work than actually like the outcome itself. So that was really important because I remember like even both in undergrad, which was in Turkey with Turkish professors, and like in graduate school with, which was in New York with, like American professors. It wasn't about the process of the design itself. Like it was about, what is my goal as a architect, in terms of like what kind of a space do I want to create? What kind of a right, like what kind of an emotion that I want to generate in people? What kind of people are going to use this? Like just talking about that, and then jumping to the okay, like how does this design reflect those goals, and are they, like sufficient or appropriate, right? Like the critique would always focus on the actual design artifact, and like the process of like me getting there was like not that important and emphasized.
That's interesting. I've heard that from other folks too who have come from an architecture background, that it's more about like what that solution is at the end and where you land rather than how you got there. That's really interesting. Very cool. So going through school, you find technology, although like technology and using computers like made their way into architecture as well. So,
Yes.
but you were using it for other things. It sounds like other types of design.
No, I mean it was for architectural design,
Oh,
but
okay.
it was like very very novel, right? Like I mean, at that point we had AutoCAD, right? Like when I was in undergrad, there was AutoCAD. Like offices were using it. There was this move from hand drafting plans or architectural diagrams, moving from like hand drawn to computer generated. But at Columbia University, it was more about using 3D software or other software to start from like a conceptual place, and then like getting into the like we never, in that education, because it was a graduate degree and they were like, you already know how to right, like do a bathroom plan or like do a floor plan. So it was more about, that like the the concept of, how do you fit your building into a certain space, and just like playing with the three-dimensional stuff. So that was the emphasis of it. And then one of the projects was doing an installation in the storefront for art and architecture in New York, which is designed by a famous New York architect, Stephen Hall. And we basically used that space to showcase our projects. And we designed the installations, we had our projects, and then another classmate and I volunteered to build the website because I was interested in using, the technology for anything possible. And when it came to the part that, oh, we need a website for this so that we can upload the videos of the installations, I raised my hand and I was a part of that as well.
Was that because you did that website? Is that sort of what showed the professor that you ended up working with that you had an interest in web design, or how did that
No,
happen?
it was different professors. Like I
Okay.
mean, yeah, like it was. I was like basically working with them on the lab, like assisting them with their teaching and all that. So I knew them. I took their classes, so they knew my interest in it. Yeah, I think I don't know. I must have, given the impression that I'm really interested in technology and exploring more of it. So they knew enough to say, "Hey, like, would you be interested in a job?" And yeah, that's how I started.
Was this like a web design job?
At first, it wasn't, surprisingly. It was more about content design and community management. And then I moved quickly into like after 6 months of doing that, I moved to the development team and started doing design and front end development.
Okay, I see.
Yeah.
So you, because you spent, I don't know, maybe 6 years dedicating your life to learning architecture, and then
Yeah.
your first job out of college was not related to that. But
No.
were you making an intentional career change? Like, did you know your career was not going to be in architecture, or did it sort of happen more organically?
I would say I don't think it happened organically. It was intentional. I think some of the drivers for it was throughout school I realized, oh, like I had this dream as I was going through architecture school. I'm gonna be the big name, right? Like I'm gonna be that like, flashy architect who goes into history books and like, I'm going to be that next person. And then I started realizing, oh, like that's not easy. It requires, in addition to a lot of talent and hard work, it also like requires a little bit of a luck because it's a very small space to kind of, I guess, fame and opportunity. And also like architecture is it, unless you're doing houses, it's a long waiting period. From the beginning of the project to the very end, you're waiting for a long time. So it takes like 10 years or something. And I was like a little impatient. And I really got attracted to how quickly you could go from, oh, I have like this idea to, oh, look, like it's already out there in the world for people to use. And, I can continue to improve on it. But that's the other thing, right? Like you design a building, it gets built. And if it goes into the hole of shame of architecture, you're done. Like there's no iteration on it, right? Like it's built. People spent millions of dollars on it. And, like it's a part of the history. And with technology, there's always room for improvement. So like I was really attracted to those.
So you go into what turned into a UX role. You go away from architecture, something
Mhm.
hooks you, but you have no like real formal training in this new field. What were some of the new skills that you feel like you had to pick up pretty quickly that you maybe weren't prepared for?
Yeah. I mean, I think I need like some more graphic design skills, right? Like I think a little like skilled in user research. Again, like, UX was a smaller discipline, right? Like it was just kind of becoming more common. And a lot of companies, you would be the one UX person, or it would be a small UX team, and we would do like everything from the research to like even sometimes implementation. So getting familiar with the technology, learning user research, understanding, the some of the methodologies that go into designing for tech, like those were things that I had to learn. I mentioned that like, UX is very process obsessed right now, but that doesn't mean like I didn't have to learn some of those things to be better at doing that.
What ended up happening to the startup?
It went out of business. It was, I joined them in 1999 and they went out of business around, I think like 2001-ish. It was the dot-com boom, like coming to an end. So it was the time when like a lot of companies were closing doors, like all of a sudden the funding was drying up. So yeah, it was one of those unfortunate endings, basically.
Did did you leave before they went out of business, or were you there through that experience?
I I actually was laid off from that company, and then I got rehired, but then left again before they went belly up. Like it was, I think I left like a month before, but you know, within the like year before it ceased operations, they had layoffs, and I was one of the people who were laid off. I got rehired afterward, but like that was a very stressful time of my life.
Oh wow. So and how long were you there for before you were laid off?
I was there for maybe like about a year or so. So it was, like new, right? Like new career, first kind of like full-time job, real job. And yeah, and I was like on an H-1B visa. So my, like the conditions of me staying in the United States and living in New York was that I had to be employed. So being laid off, like starts a completely different kind of clock for someone on a work visa. You're not just like, oh, I have to pay my rent, I have to pay my bills, I have, like I have to find a new job. But also, oh, like if I don't find a new job in a certain amount of time, I have to leave. It was, I think at the time it was like 2 weeks. You have to find a new job within two, which is impossible, especially when the tech industry was basically, crashing all around, right? Like it wasn't exactly a great job market. Yeah.
Wow. So what'd you do?
I cried a lot, I will say. I cried a lot. And then like I immediately like put together my resume and I started like just sending it to every company that seemed to be hiring. And anyone who gave me an interview, I would just talk to them. And I actually like got an offer from a company at the same time that like my old company said, hey, we want to hire you back. And, because somebody else who hadn't been laid off had quit and, they were, oh, we'll just like get you back for that role. So I chose instead of the new unknown company, I chose to go back, which was actually lucky because the other company went belly up before the one I worked for. So, you know, bullet dodged. I think I would have been laid off again pretty soon.
I'm just trying to imagine where you were at. Because like you said, early in your career, like fresh out of graduate school, you've decided to make this big career change.
Mhm.
You're only there for maybe about a year and then you're laid off.
Yeah.
The industry is imploding to some extent.
Yeah.
Did you have doubts about pursuing this field? Like, did you consider going back to architecture? Or
I did. Like that was one time. And then like, maybe like 10 years into it, there was another period where again, it was totally related to immigration, like being on a visa, waiting for my green card and like being stuck at a company that I felt like I wasn't growing in, which on hindsight, actually, all the challenges that I had at that company did help me grow a lot. But, in the moment, I was like, I need to go back to architecture. So, like, yeah, at that moment, too, I was looking at architecture jobs, too. The unfortunate thing is, architecture is a very, it's an industry that gets, like, impacted by any changes in economy a lot, right? Because when people with money no longer have money, they're not hiring architects, they're not building buildings, they're not design like right updating their homes. So architects weren't hiring exactly either. Yeah, like so I had to just basically go both ways, but like eventually ended up staying in tech. And 10 years later, it was a similar thing where I really wanted to change jobs, but I thought, oh, like, should I just do architecture instead? And at that point, all my friends who were architects and stayed in architecture said, no, don't do it. They all said, this is just like a thankless job. We don't get paid enough. We work a long time, like long hours every day. You should just, like stay where you are in tech and like, instead of designing buildings, one day, like you can have enough money to hire someone to design your building.
aside from this like moment of crisis where you were laid off and you very quickly had to find your next job,
Mhm.
how do you feel like being someone who is working maybe in tech, or maybe tech doesn't make a difference, but working in the US on a visa, like how do you feel like that affected the way that you would work, or maybe even how you would do a design job?
Yeah. I mean, I don't think it necessarily impacted how I like designed or did work at the companies that I joined, but it definitely impacted the job search and the companies I ended up working at, right? That's because when you're in that situation, especially back in those days, like there were a lot of, I mean, I don't know, maybe it's still the case, like for smaller companies, they would say like you should pay for like we'll hire you. And if you want a sponsorship, you have to pay the lawyer fee, right? Because, a company has to hire a lawyer to fill out their paperwork and all that. And at that time, like I hadn't, been in the industry and I didn't save enough money. And my parents at the time, like couldn't help me. I couldn't just pay thousands of dollars to a lawyer. So like those jobs were out. And then there were other companies that were saying, well, we need someone to start today or like as soon as possible. And this is like your whole like visa thing is going to take months. So, we'll choose someone who already has a work permit, who is already a citizen. So it does limit some of the like options in front of someone. And then like once you get to a job, leaving that job could become difficult, right? Depending on where you are in your immigration process. Like I know, for example, a lot of people from India in tech wait for their green cards for like over a decade or maybe even longer. And they just like have to make do with their existing current employers, even when there might be opportunities that are better fit for them. So it's hard. I mean, I was lucky because like Turkey is not restricted in that way. So like even during my green card process, I was able to switch jobs and go to Salesforce, for example. But most people don't have that luxury.
I see. Let's talk a little bit about the time that you had at Salesforce, because you started as an IC designer, and
Yes.
over the few years that you were there, you moved into management.
Yes.
What was that transition like for you from going from IC to managing other designers?
Yeah, I think I'm excited with, I was promoted to become a lead designer at some point, like a couple of years into my tenure at Salesforce. And then my manager assigned me a project that was over a large area where like two other designers were also designing for it. Right. And, my responsibility as the lead designer was not only designing a certain part of the product that I was responsible for, but also working with the other designers who were more junior than me and aligning our projects together, making sure that our designs fit together, you know, the design strategy, like all of that stuff, right? Like so I was kind of like mentoring and leading them in the design, like I guess design process and execution. And at that time, my manager at the time said, "Oh, I think you would make a great manager. Why don't you consider that?" And I was like, "No, no, no, no. I like the craft. I want to still like do the design. I'm happy like this." So I stayed as an IC for maybe like another year. But eventually I realized that like some of the most rewarding parts of the job had become helping the other designers succeed. So, there were a few times that one of the designers had like got into this impasse with their PM partner, and the PM partner was much more senior than them. So like had this weird power dynamic, right? And this designer asked me for help, and I was able to help them move forward and achieve something. And I started realizing when they launched their projects, I felt pride. I was like, oh, like this is very satisfying because like even though I wasn't the designer for this project, I really was instrumental in making sure that it happened and it didn't get stuck somewhere. That was the moment when, obviously during this time, my manager kept asking me if I wanted to try out management, and I kept saying no. And eventually I said, yes, I would like to try management. So like the designers I was helping out became my direct report. So the transition was amazing for me. Like that, I think my manager did a great job just matching me with people that I was already working with in the area that I was already overseeing. So I had to only focus on the things that I needed to learn about management.
I think a lot of people move into management roles or sort of push into management roles before they're ready. And then a lot of that reflection that you're talking about, they don't get a chance to do that until after they're in a management role. And I think
Yeah.
sometimes that makes that transition really rough. Sounds like, and credit to your manager, you had that opportunity to sort of reflect first. And so it was a very
Yeah.
like intentional choice by the time you moved into management.
Exactly. Yeah. That's true. I think that was really great foresight. Like I mean, I think that taught me something when I was coaching other designers to move into management as well, like how I made sure that their first teams were structured, how they moved into that role. For example, one of the things that he had done was that when I said, okay, I'm willing to try there, he said, I'm going to send you to the management boot camp, which was for new managers before you become a manager. So I don't know, like if he had to get special permission or whatnot, but he said the management boot camp is going to show you all the dirty and kind of like the stressful parts of management, right? Like, how do you manage performance and how do you deal with bad performance? Or like, if you have like some people who are, adversarial on your team, how do you like manage those things? He was like, after you take that class, if you still are exciting, then like I have a team ready for you. That was great because it was educational. Like I knew what I was gonna get into, and I still said, what, I'm ready for this. I can learn all of these things. Yeah.
The example that you gave earlier of like being able to build these bridges between designers that you're working with and like their PM or their engineer. I mean, that's definitely, I think, an important and welcome skill for a lot of managers. But it like you have to be good at that. And where did you learn that?
That's a tough one. I don't know. I think a part of it is natural. Part of it is practice, right? Like learning from failures. Like, I mean, I've had my times when I would go head to head with my engineering partners, and then like hear some negative feedback through my manager, right? Like, oh, you're being too pushy and aggressive. Like, you should negotiate better or something. It's just like I think if you pay attention to when you succeeded and when you didn't succeed and try to learn from that and try to kind of like keep using the successful tips and tricks. The other part of it was I'm never shy or ashamed to ask for help and advice from my managers. Some people get scared that like, oh, if I ask for help, if I say like I can't do this, it's going to reflect badly on me. And, my manager is going to think that I'm incompetent. I don't have that fear. My belief is that if my manager is the person who's going to think like that, I don't want to work with them anyway. And unlike that with my team as well, they can ask me anything, ask for help for anything. And I never pass judgment on them for asking too many questions or asking for help. So that helps too, because then you learn from your manager, right? Like they coach you in a good way to do the right thing.
Earlier, you were talking about learning from past failure so you can develop tips and tricks. For someone who is maybe earlier in their career and struggling with their product manager or their engineer, what are some tips and tricks that you've learned that you might share with them for getting over that hump?
I think so. The biggest thing is, we are user experience professionals, and I always tell them, well, do some like user research on your product and engineering partners. Like think of them as your target user, right? Like understand what they care about, understand like what pressure they are under from their manager, right? Like, we as designers are being asked to deliver great design by our managers. But engineers and product managers are being measured on different types of things. So I think understanding that and learning how to frame a design solution in a way that shows them, okay, this will help you achieve your goal as well, right? Or like this will help, even better is like like everyone at the company cares about the customer, and I hope they do, explaining this helps the customer in this way and like helps the business further. I think a lot of things that I did this for a long time as well. Like as a designer, I used to be, almost like a purist, right? Like it had to be perfect design. Like you have to implement it as it is. And I don't like care if you say this is really hard to implement and it's going to take months. Like this is what we need to do. That's what good design is. But that doesn't work, right? You can't be a design purist in an environment where, there's a business, there are customers. Customers need different things. And, the business needs to stay alive to continue providing this product to the customers. So understanding business and being able to frame the design work like within the business goals is really an important skill. And like it took me a long time to learn that skill they unfortunately they don't teach that like in design schools or like in architecture school either.
So if you're compromising on these sort of like purist values, where does that leave things like quality and craft in the work that you and your team do?
I would say like I wouldn't compromise on quality, right? I think, again, like coming from the architecture, right? Like there's the regulation, there's the law that say, hey, like you can't do this, like your building shape cannot be this. It has to be some other way. Here are your constraints. And like you have to find a good design within that. So I think that it just gives you maybe some constraints to find a solution that's gonna work within the constraints. So I think, you know, it's important to learn to compromise in a way that's not just like giving up and saying, you know what, like fine, right? Like let's just launch bad software because that should not be the goal. But there's also like other things to consider, right? Like I think, I have seen like really beautifully designed software that had such bad performance, nobody used it, right? Like, so, like, you have to think about it holistically. You know what I mean? Like, quality is not just about design quality in the product, it's also about, technology and, the quality of that performance and security, all that stuff. I think understanding all of those and finding the solution that really synthesize it, it's like that's the key to good craft.
One thing that I think is can be really interesting and sort of fun about UX is in the example that you gave in architecture, a lot of the constraints are laws that are like fairly like fixed. Like there isn't a lot that you can do within the time frame of a project
Mhm.
to go and change those. In UX, it can be really tricky for someone who is newer to the field because some of the constraints are fixed and should sort of be treated the way that you were talking about with architecture, but
Mhm.
some of them are not, but they require like pushing or negotiation or a little bit more creativity.
Mhm. Yeah.
How, for someone that hasn't built up that intuition over years, what advice would you have for someone to try to tell the difference between like what is fixed and what should be negotiated?
Yeah, I think so. If you're lucky and working at a company that has a design team, right? I think collaboration with other designers, design critiques, just kind of making sure that like other designers are also watching your project and giving you feedback because they, like the people who have been at the company longer or the people who are more senior can see some of those points of negotiation that you do not see, right? I think, you know, especially, I think teams are much greater than the sum of individuals. And if you're in a team and if you have other designers to lean on, that's like number one. And then the other one, still for designers who have other designers in the company, but also those of you who just work alone at a startup, just inviting and involving the engineers in the solution design, right? Like, I mean, designers and engineers are kind of like very similar in some ways, right? Like engineers are solving problems with code and technology, and we are kind of like solving problems with, on Figma, but like trying to create the flows and the user interface. But like it's really kind of like they're connected to each other. And I've seen that when engineers are invited to solve the problem, they will volunteer some of these, right? Like the right here's some flexibility and here's like no flexibility. Like they might just come up with an even better solution that's going to work technically and from a UX point of view. So I would just make sure that, you're not designing in a silo and then like giving the engineers the specs and saying, okay, like now implement it. I think they should be invited to participate in the design.
I think that's great advice, especially if either the designer isn't technical enough or maybe what you're working on is so technical that it really requires an engineer in the room, it can be really difficult to untangle and figure out which constraints are real and which ones aren't without their participation. So,
Yeah. I mean, it also helps. Sorry, it also helps. Like, you always ask your engineering partner, like, "Are you sure that's impossible to do? Like, is there some other way you can do this?" Like, 'cause, people can be taking shortcuts too. I'm lazy. I take shortcuts, so like they all have a pile of work that they need to deliver, right? Like, so they won't want to spend time on certain things more than they need to. So I think like you're nudging them and saying, hey, like, I think this will be really good if we could figure this out. Like, you can insist a little.
cool. Such great advice. So after you left Salesforce, you went to Rotten Fields, which is like a totally different industry.
Yes.
First, why? Like, what prompted the decision?
So at Salesforce, at that time, I had been there for about 6 years, and the product that I was, leading the design team for was like got released at Dreamforce, and I was like, oh, like that's great, right? Like a big Dreamforce announcement, and I said that's a good time to kind of like try something new because like getting a product launched at Dreamforce is kind of like the ultimate, prize that you could have at Salesforce as a designer. So I said, well, like I've been in the industry, but doing B2B software. Like I was in developer software. I was, at Salesforce, I was designing for the platform and analytics teams. So I said, oh, I want to like do some consumer stuff. And when I started looking for a job, I was imagining, well, like, I can go to like Uber or, some tech company and now, work on their consumer side of things, or even like get a job in the kind of maybe the more technical side and move to consumer side a little. But then like I saw this job ad for a skincare company that was, going through digital transformation. It was right across the street from, Salesforce. So yeah, like I applied and, interviewed and they gave me the job, which was shocking because I had no experience in consumer tech. I didn't have any experience in traditional companies that are brick and mortar, right? Like bu- building real products. Yeah, that was a different experience.
A lot of people feel like they get pigeonholed into certain like verticals because, if you've only worked on business software, you can only get, a job working on B2B products. If you've all done consumer, you stay in consumer. Like you sort of get typecast almost. And when people want to make the change, it's tricky because it's like, well, they want that similar experience, but you have to get the job first to get the experience. So it's the whole chicken or the egg.
Yeah.
What advice do you have for someone that is maybe trying to make a shift into a very different space and doesn't have prior
Mhm.
experience?
I would say maybe like trying to understand what challenges might be and what might be the reasons that a company might not consider you. Because I mean, like we hear like, and I'd be still like mostly in B2B software, and sometimes like hiring managers will talk like, well, like this person, we want a person from a consumer product background. Our software, our users have such complex needs. Like, is this person even gonna pull off like designing for such complex space, right? Or, consumer is the same. Like, they have the assumption that B2B software is like really ugly and clunky because the designers are incompetent. But it's not. It's because like it's really trying to solve complex multiple business processes that are like different from company to company, right? Like, I think you have to kind of like, in a way, anticipate what those rejections might be and understand like what your answer might be to those. I must say, like when I was looking for a consumer company, the reason that I didn't get a job at Uber, I applied and they didn't respond, right? Like, so yes, it is true that there are a lot of companies where, like you submit your resume and like they will say, like this person came from B2B. We're not gonna even consider it. But like, there will be a company that's going to be intrigued enough. I think now, like, there are more tools to basically prove that you understand what the reservations might be by that company, and like be prepared to speak to those. For example, in my case, the VP of product who was the hiring manager said, like, it's great, but like, do you have any experience in like retail, fashion, skincare industry? Like, do you understand those? I mean, my answer was very smart ass because I said, well, I have not designed software in those industries, but I'm an avid consumer for all of those things. And, I know like how hard it is to, right, like get the product right for the customer. And, I'll do my best to learn the business. And, and I know my area. Like, I'm a great UX leader. I'm a good UX designer, and I'll help this company get like their design forward. So, it's just a matter of, hey, I understand I don't know some things, but here are my strengths that, I can lend to you, and I'll learn what I don't know. I think that's the message. But be prepared not to get any responses to your, resume requests. And even better, if you know someone who works at that company, try to get a referral or an introduction to a hiring manager so that you can pitch your value like in person as opposed to through your resume.
Um, I think especially right now with the job market being as competitive as it is, figuring out how to do things like getting referred in or anything that can give you kind of an edge to get further in the process, a lot of people are looking for right now. For someone who is like brand new to this and they haven't built up much of a network, like how do you have any advice for how to go about that?
Yeah, I think what I see, now, like on the manager side, right? We've hired for a few roles, and you post the role online, especially in this economy. Like, there's a ton of like applications flowing in, and I think like it's really important to have a resume that like highlights your strengths and like what you're good at, as opposed to generic, hey, I worked at this company, I designed whatever, whatever, right? Like, what difference did you make for that company, right? Like, why you being there was a good thing as opposed to like someone else being there. I think, a lot of times, resumes come in as I did this, I did that, but, was there some like result, right? Like improving something or like changing culture, whatever it is, like at your job that you did. And then also sometimes like it's good to tailor like that, like, kind of the objective, right? Like the top of that resume to the company you're applying to. It's very easy to tell if a resume is like someone just sitting by their computer and uploading their resume into every job ad there, or if they really like kind of wanted to get a job at your company. I think it's important to spend a little time. Like, I had, even for my last job, like there was a different portfolio story. I mean, it was the same projects, but based on the company, the order of things was different for each company that I was applying or interviewing for, because, I knew that they wanted a certain type of skill, or their business was a certain type of business. And I thought, oh, like these things in my portfolio or resume are going to be more interesting to this company, and that some other things are going to be more interesting to this other company.
You spent a good amount of time on the other side too, as the hiring manager, looking at other folks' applications, resumes. So, usually if you have a candidate coming in, there's a few different things you could look at. You'll have their resume, you'll probably have their LinkedIn profile, you'll have their portfolio for a designer. How do you weight those as a hiring manager? Like what's most important for you versus what's least important? Like how much do you think each one influences your decision to move forward?
LinkedIn and resume are rather good to give me context about, okay, like what kinds of companies this person worked in, right? Like, was it big companies, startups, like how long they've been in the industry, did they change roles? Like it's a good kind of overview. I don't really, other than that, I don't really pay a whole lot of attention to the individual details. I think in design, my portfolio is the big thing because I want to know like what problems did you solve and how did you solve them? Like, was it a good solution? And what were some of the roadblocks that you came across? Even it's okay to even have a failure story as long as like you're kind of framing it in a way that, hey, like this was a problem, this was my solution, and it didn't work out, and I learned these things. So, I became a better designer.
So after you left Ron and Fields, you were at Google, and you
Yes.
started as a senior manager, and then you were promoted to director. What did you learn was different about, especially at a company as large as Google, what's different about being in a senior manager role versus being a director? Did anything surprise you?
This is gonna be sound funny, but like, when you're a senior manager or a manager at a big company, you're like, oh, like we had middle management, and like all these execs have like so much more context and so much more information or access, right? Like they have a lot more like power to do like what they think they should do, or like, to achieve their goals or whatever it is. And then like you move to director at Google and you realize, oh, I'm still a middle manager, but now I have more accountability. Right? Like now, like I can't say, oh, those execs are, like that's why I couldn't, like do whatever. I mean, I never said that. Like I would always, I was very driven in terms of let's solve the problems, like build the relationships. But you realize, oh yeah, like, you know, we are all kind of middle managers at different levels. So that means at both levels, you have to work with your peers, you have to lead your team, and you have to influence your leaders. Like that's kind of the right, like the job as a manager of any level. It's just that like your scope increases, your team gets bigger. So now like you're not leading your team individual by individual, but through the leaders that report to you. And Yep. Yeah. So like just like the 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 job is kind of like the same, but maybe the details that evolve, and you have to like scale a little bigger. And then, like when I was a senior manager, I was leading only Google Analytics team. And then I became a director. It was for a while, it was still Google Analytics, but eventually, I added like there were two other big organizations added, and then you have to like scale back from right your expertise area, which is the comfortable area, and then start like leaning into the new things, and also balancing, right? Like how much detail do you need to have in each of those areas to effectively lead? So it becomes a different thing than, being a manager responsible for a very specific product.
When, I mean, from the very beginning, when we first talked about you moving into a management role, like sort of guiding and mentoring other designers was a big part of, I think, how you thought about the role. And then, fast forward, as a director at Google, how do you feel like your perspective on that changed? Like, how did your approach to helping, like, mentoring individuals change over the years?
I, say it's like it's changed per se, but like it became richer and evolved. Like there are some lessons you learn, right? Like, one of the things is as kind of when you're a new manager, you're really focused on like everyone liking you. I mean, I'm still like I love being liked by my team, and I think they like me. But like you're so focused on that, right? Sometimes like you can be a manager who is like a little permissive, right? Like a little too empathetic and not like challenging your team or, someone on your team enough, or spend too much time with a low performer trying to help them improve while like kind of ignoring the high performers, right? As you grow in your career, you start learning that, some of those choices that you should spend as much time with your high performers as you do with your low performers, because like they need the support and they need to grow, and they're like basically going to be, hopefully, like some of them are going to be your replacements one day. And, that's important. And also being nice and empathetic, or like being light, doesn't necessarily mean that, you should always be positive. You should always give good feedback, right? Like it's really important to have that candor. And, if somebody is going in the wrong direction or has done something, you know, bad, like you basically tell them immediately. And, like it's kind of interesting because like the first time you do it, you're like, oh my goodness, like this person is going to take it badly, right? Like this is really bad feedback and, they're going to be crushed. But almost always, like even if they react kind of like negatively at the beginning, like it's always been a better experience and like really help the people eventually. I think it has to come from like wanting to help people grow. And you can't always like give, bad feedback like with no purpose.
I think for a lot of people, they look at your career and there's a lot that they will probably aspire to. Like you've consistently grown into like bigger and more influential roles in over the course of your career, but you've also gone through a lot of ups and downs, and whether going through layoffs or transitions and having to learn new industries. Right now, I think can be a really difficult time because the industry, the market is tough. And so what advice do you have for someone who maybe is feeling a little bit uncertain right now about how things are going, the direction of their career or their future in this industry?
Yeah. I would say when you look back, I mean, it's this, I was laid off early in my career, and then I was laid off like in 2003 when Google did the big layoff, right? Like I woke up in the morning and decided to look at my phone, and I saw that there was an email from Google on my personal email address. And I said, why would like work send me an email on my personal? So it was like, just wake up and you realize. And it was hard, right? Like, even though I had an established career and like, financially I was fine, and not everyone is. So, so what, right? Like you would say, well, I can take a few months off and like find a new job, but that's not the case, right? Like sometimes like it could be difficult from a financial point of view or like some other considerations. It's also a big blow to the ego. I mean, like, yes, like the layoffs were really like eliminating roles, but I had a lot of self-doubt afterwards, even though I had been in the industry and could point to a lot of success stories. Like that moment, I was like, oh, maybe I'm not good at this. Maybe like I didn't ever deserve to be that director. And like that's like they figured it out and laid me off, right? So I think my advice would be like, don't try not to dwell in like the negative aspects of it. That we never know why we might have been laid off, right? Like even if someone was laid off because they were a low performer, inherently we all have the capacity to a great job, and there are circumstances and reasons that end up with someone not performing at a job. Maybe it's not the right culture. Maybe it's not the right team, or right, like it could be anything. Maybe it's personal things that are causing you not to be able to pay attention to work. So like, it's not about you. So I'd have to like tell that to myself. And I had, a couple of people that I was on a chat with who were also laid off, and we would kind of like give each other, no, you're going to be fine, like go for it. And it was kind of funny because some of us were interviewing for the exact same roles. Because in leadership, right? That means jobs. I mean, talk about, like not a lot of jobs in UX. Like it's even less in leadership if you're trying to get like an equivalent job. And, there were a lot of leaders who got laid off because when you're cutting down workforce for financial reasons, like you better cut off some people who are the highest paid individuals in the company. And now like all these highly qualified like directors from Meta and Google and like other companies are competing for the same role. So we would just basically say, oh, like I just interviewed at this company. And then like this other person would say, oh yeah, like I'm interviewing for the same role. But I think like it really helped. Like if you have people that you can commiserate with and like share the experience with, like it really helps get through it. And in the grand scheme of things, like while going through it is really difficult and, bad for the ego, sometimes bad for the finances, like it's just a blip in our careers. Like I was laid off twice and it's still just a little blip in my 20 plus year career. And who knows, like maybe I'll get laid off again. Cause like I still have like another however many, like another several decades until I retire. So like, I might get laid off a few more times. So I don't know. Yeah.
Beril, thank you so much for sharing
Thank you.
much of your journey and also just providing such a candid view into some of the difficult moments that you've had in your career. I think it's so helpful for people who are either going through moments like that or maybe just to prepare them for things that happen and things that are possible and giving them some words of encouragement. Where, if people want to follow you online or connect with you, where can they find you online?
I think these days LinkedIn is probably the best place. I used to be, I'm still on Twitter, but I'm not loving to post on Twitter anymore. So I would say, yes, connect me with me on LinkedIn, follow me on LinkedIn. And yeah, I would love to hear from folks. Like if they found any of this valuable.
Great. Thanks again. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you.
All right. I'll see you.
Bye.
And that wraps our conversation with Beril Maples. Her journey is a testament to resilience, adaptability, and the power of embracing change, even when it's thrust upon you. If you found this episode valuable, make sure to subscribe to the podcast so you never miss out on more inspiring stories and career lessons from leaders in design. Thanks for watching. I'm Chris Abad, and we'll see you next time on Pixelated Path.